industry 100 years ago, and they're still operating today. The last one I'm going to talk about is Kensington. It also is near Juneau, but not close enough to be on the grid, so they rely entirely on diesel. Both Kensington and Juneau, they're close, Kensington and Greens Creek, they're close to the city of Juneau, but they're a boat ride away, so all of the workers have to live on site. So efficiencies. As I said, it's in their interest to find every possible way to reduce their energy costs, but for some of them, because of their remote location, it's very, very difficult to do. So they're taking small steps. They're trying to change corporate culture, employee culture, turn off lights, turn off the fans in between mine blasts, change the lights in the mill from sodium to LED, and every little bit helps. Some of the bigger things, Red Dog recently changed all of their mobile equipment to have temperature starts. So you may not know that when you operate in the Arctic, you actually have to leave the equipment running 24/7 in the wintertime, because if you turn the engine off, it freezes up and you don't start it again. So you can imagine, what it's like to have all of this equipment running all of the time. With the temperature starts, they actually have a gauge. They can turn off the equipment, and the gauge recognizes when the temperature in the engine gets below a certain amount, and then it starts the engine again. So they're actually able to make considerable efficiencies by being able to turn the equipment off. At Pogo, they realized that their annual costs for taking their food and camp waste, the 3 hours out of Pogo towards Fairbanks, and the tipping fees at the landfill, were costing them about $1 million annually. So they put in a propane incinerator, and they're able to make considerable savings as a result. They're also using propane to heat. It's an underground mine, so they have 2 portals, and they use propane to actually heat the portals to keep the mine at a steady 45-degree temperature. They're also using propane for cooking and in one of their 2 camps. Of course, energy issues are one of the cost drivers for people looking at developing mines in Alaska. That's the demand that the projects think that they will be needing in order to develop their mines. And each of them, not surprisingly, is looking at hydro, LNG, natural gas options, anything that can get them away from some of that very expensive shipped oil and diesel. So Donlin's actually just started permitting, which is probably sort of it's a multi-year process, or minimum 2 or 3 years. And they're looking at a natural gas pipeline. Not only would it be cleaner and more efficient, but it actually has the added bonus of providing an opportunity for villages along the route to have access to that natural gas. Right now, those villages, for their power generation and home heating, rely on diesel that is barged up the river when the river is not frozen. So you can imagine what high cost that is, and to be able to access natural gas would be huge. Of course, there's a lot of infrastructure that would need to be in place, and it's expensive, so it's not a guarantee, but there is that option for them. Live and Good would build a transmission line to Fairbanks, and there's a lot of talk right now about ways to make energy more efficient in terms of power generation in Fairbanks, whether it's LNG trucked from the North Slope of Alaska where the oil production is, or access to a natural gas pipeline. Niblack is actually looking at putting their mill in a totally different place than their mine, so that they can access hydropower near Ketchikan for their mill, because their mill actually requires more energy than the mine. And Pebble's looking at a variety of options. So what does all this talk about energy mean for people in Alaska? I think that it's quite an irony. Despite living in an incredibly energy-rich state, we have these really high costs for power generation and for heating our homes, especially in our rural and remote areas. And that's because we're challenged by the vast size of the state, the lack of infrastructure, and you just can't really get the economies of scale when your population is so small. So it's not surprising that access to affordable energy is one of the biggest policy debates in the state right now. But the solutions are not near term. There's nothing that's going to help with those heating bills next year. What does help when those heating bills come in is to have a good job, and mining provides some very good jobs in Alaska. Average salary is $100,000 a year, which is double the state average. And one of the most important things is that a lot of those jobs are in remote and rural areas where there's a very high cost of living and not a lot of other economic opportunities. So I hope this gives you the local context to help this discussion on industry and energy. Thank you.
Washington, D.C. Jeff Rickert is the Deputy Director of the AFL-CIO, working for America Institute, and runs the AFL-CIO Center on Green Jobs. In this capacity, he oversees the programs of the Institute and their implementation, while also assisting the AFL-CIO and unions to pursue workforce and economic development strategies, particularly those related to green jobs, and creating partnerships to develop pathways out of poverty into high-road careers. He brings more than 15 years of working to get America on the economic and environmental high road. Most recently, Jeff was the policy director for Green for All, an organization committed to advocating for and creating jobs in the green economy that are accessible to underrepresented communities. In that role, he developed federal policy initiatives working with the federal administration and both chambers of the U.S. Congress. Prior to that, he provided consulting services and public policy advice on climate change and energy policy to the clients of Helios Strategies, a government relations firm. He also served as a senior vice president and chief of staff for the Apollo Alliance, a clean energy coalition of more than 300 labor, business, environmental, and community-based organizations dedicated to a public investment agenda for achieving energy independence through clean energy and good jobs. Jeff holds a Master's of Science in Economic Sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he also worked at the Center on Wisconsin Strategy. He has done extensive study of manufacturing, hospitality, healthcare, media, and technology. Jeff?
Sorry, I didn't realize I sent in the long version of my bio. There goes 8 minutes of my talk right there. So I operate sort of at the nexus of many different constituency groups working with the labor movement, the environmental movement, government, industry, civil rights communities, all of which renders me relatively unintelligible to just about anybody. But one thing that I've been doing is watching lots of TED Talks. So I realize that when you say things short and simple and slowly, they sound very profound. And I joke that I don't deal with simplicity. We have to joke around with Apollo, where John F. Kennedy had the famous quote, "We don't do it because it's easy, we do it because it's hard." Like in Washington, we don't do it because it's simple, we make it complicated. So, but one thing that is relatively uncontroversial, and which is why it's such a major focus of the labor movement, is an industrial inefficiency. I'm going to start out by just telling you why labor movement has an interest, point to some of the sort of evidence that makes us think that this is a good bet, talk about some of the things that we're doing, and then finish up with some of the challenges. Most really importantly is financing the role of labor pension funds in the execution of these projects. So the reason we're interested is pretty obvious, especially over the course of the last 5 years. Our top priority is the creation of jobs. Right now we want the creation of jobs and we'll make them better, but we also think that this is the preservation of good skilled jobs that we already employ people in. And we see that by focusing on energy efficiency, we improve production processes, we reduce energy consumption, we generally make ourselves more competitive, lower the reasons for outsourcing work, and as global price volatility increases, we insulate ourselves from that and create a reason to bring some of that work back. One of the things that's most stunning to me about doing the politics around this is when a research report comes out that does not have a measure of the job creation potential from undertaking industrial energy efficiency, or any energy efficiency measure for that matter. SCIP has been one of our great allies in helping to make that case, because really the complicated part is just dealing with the human element of this and convincing even our shop floor workers what their interest is in this. And then not only in so doing revealing their interest, but also the ways that they'll benefit from it and make their lives better. But all important to that is the job study. And there are a couple of good ones that make us think that this is a good bet. One by McKinsey contends that if we reduce our energy consumption by 18% in the industrial sector, we'll save $442 billion. If we increase we double our energy efficiency investments, we'll create 600,000 new jobs along the way. If you look just at combined heat and power, increasing the amount of energy created by combined heat and power by 20% will create 1 million new jobs. And so for us, we see this as both saving the jobs and the competitiveness of the firm, but the creation of the construction jobs that will go into installing all of the equipment, or into the maintenance job that goes into improving all of those machines. So we've become big fans of combined heat and power and waste heat recovery. And that's particularly important for our process industries like the steel workers, chemical workers, the paper workers that are very energy intensive and can benefit from large capital investments in the physical plant that can reap these savings. But we have a whole other part of the labor movement in the industrial sector, which is predominantly what we would think of as assembly, where the energy savings aren't immediately obvious. And so there we've been working with those unions to identify, where are the points that you use energy? What are what are your out-of-date motors? What machines can stand to be updated? And then looking at simple things about the building, like lighting and other building infrastructure. So we've seen this work in a number of places. I think most recently, most famously, was a good story from the Recovery Act, where ArcelorMittal received a $31.6 million grant that ended up saving $100 million in their electricity bill by installing CHP. We have investments made by Flambeau River Papers of that led to them saving $105 million and adding, not only saving 300 jobs, but adding 50 more and increasing the production at that facility by 12%. Thought I had one more job study. The rest are all financial ones, which violates my point about the job studies. But the point is that they all generally lead to cost savings that allow us to preserve work here in the U.S. So, and that brings me to sort of what are our barriers. One is just education of the opportunity. And I think we've done, as a labor movement, a very good job of tackling that. Now, we have resolution from our Industrial Union Council, which is the presidents of all of the major manufacturing unions, and a resolution and commitment from the building trades around a similar initiative. We'll be going to our convention in September, where we'll be able to, which is a quadrennial convention, which will allow us to pass a convention resolution, which is sort of almost a constitutional amendment, where we will also advance the idea of industrial energy efficiency. The second thing is just having the in-house expertise. So we know a lot about organizing, we know a lot about political messaging, we know a lot about policy, but we don't have a lot of engineers. We have one union of engineers, and they're pretty much taken up by Boeing, and a couple of other outfits, a couple of other utilities. And we've steadily, as reaching out to Skip is one example, but we increasingly reaching out to secure our own technical expertise on this, so that we can go in knowledgeable about the changes that we think should be made. And one of those has been a partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund, where they've helped us to bring in a process engineer to evaluate plant opportunities with the staff. And lastly, and I think this is our biggest challenge, not because, it's access to capital. And I think that challenge has changed over time. I think that you could look at the recession as a crisis of capital, where much of it evaporated, a significant portion of it evaporated, particularly in our pension funds during the original recession. And now it's figuring out the way, now that some of that's been restored, figuring out the ways that you can effectively move that into investing in this area. I've spent the last year working with a group of about 24 capital steward policy experts from the labor movement, looking at just how our pension funds work and how we can get them investing into this area. Our pension funds are worth, to the surprise of many, around $6.5 trillion between the public funds and the private funds. Most of that passively invested, and I was telling to Skip a coffee this morning that when I talk to venture capitalists about this, they want to know what the holdup is in terms of getting money into the market. And I'm like, well, when you're a trustee on a pension board, you have two goals. One, to hit your relatively conservative return on investment and not go to jail. And so we have to be a little bit more patient, and there are a lot more rules, and we haven't really thought about how to actively invest our money in domestic job creation seriously until about 5 years ago. And then once you get into it, you realize how complicated it is, and how many hoops, and what an individual sort of groupthink problem it is, because you not only have to convince one person, you have to advise 2,000 people to be risk averse, or be not risk averse, excuse me. And the simplest way, I think, and we're moving quickly towards doing that, is identifying efficiency as an asset class that can be safely invested in. And I tell people that the labor movement's willing to invest in things like this, but they need to know it's safe, and they very rarely want to be the first ones in. So whatever we can do to demonstrate the success of these projects and that they're a safe investment will open up the floodgates of that and allow us to really take this to scale. And to close, the other part of my energy efficiency hat is I'm managing the retrofit of our national headquarters in Washington, D.C. And we are just, this morning, I'm told that we just finally worked out the contract with our window contractor to install the new windows in the building. That represents a 2.5 year, or 2 years and 2 months trek to get to that point. And I tell people as this is one of the challenges that we have to unpack, because when we talk about the boon that the commercial and real estate energy efficiency area can be, or the industrial energy efficiency area, if my building, which is owner occupied, is any example of how difficult it is, it's no wonder that this hasn't exploded yet. And so I think, obviously with my master's in sociology, all you got's a hammer, everything's a nail. I think there's a real sociological problem about how we interact. So with that, I think that's it, and I turn it back over to Leah.
Thanks, open the floor for questions or comments. If you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Steve Pratt. I'm a local economist here. I guess this is for Skip, maybe Jeff too. Is the biggest issue, is it incorrect price signals, incorrect understanding of price signals, or government interference in terms of permitting, in terms of making the process complicated to make investments? And I agree with about every analysis I've seen points to capital investments lead to cost savings as well as just energy savings. And you see that, Global's out there, building owners, managers associated at all their meetings. You got Honeywell, you mentioned Rockwell, there's Milwaukee, you got GE, you got firms that are working with firms. Is it the government that's standing in the way? Is it just understanding the economics? Is it, what is it?
That's a darn good question, actually. I might suggest two immediate answers to that. First is that efficiency is an invisible resource. If you were to look at a car driving, say, 100 miles from here to there, you might not know whether it's getting 13 miles, 45 miles, or 60 miles to the gallon. It would not be immediately obvious to. Or looking at lighting in this room, we would have no idea whether we're getting 100 lumens to the watt or 13 lumens to the watt. So a lot of it's got to do with the invisibility of the resource. But that stems, in my opinion, from the second element, which is, for very understandable reasons, we've grown accustomed to thinking supply side on everything. That is to say, we have an easy access early part of our history to things like timber, energy of sorts, materials of all kinds. Labor is always a critical resource of shortages, but the physical resource, metals, mining, minerals, energy, timber, wood, that sort of thing, was easy access. So we developed a supply focus, and we directed a lot of our policies and our pricing, I think, directed to make sure we had adequate supply at the time we needed it. What we're suggesting instead is we're beginning to run out of room, wiggle room, because we have not really thought through the efficient use of those resources as we might. For example, I think people in this room would be surprised to learn that at the Shell Eco Marathon, the record fuel economy for a research vehicle, gasoline engine, admittedly, and this is a research vehicle, not designed to be a consumer car, is 8,000 miles per gallon. We tend to think we're doing good if we get 50 miles a gallon. And we tend to say, if I ask an audience, how far might you imagine we could go? We get maybe 100 miles or 200 miles a gallon. That may be right, but we approach it with a timid perspective, thinking that we're already constrained. We're gone about as far as we can go. We need more supply, rather than stepping back and rethinking or refocusing on what the actual physical problem is in the first place, and then matching the needed resources to accomplish that bit of work or that task. So it, in many ways, I think, requires a reorienting of how we understand the economic process. And in the case of the U.S., that 14% inefficiency, that is to say, the wasting of 86% of all the energy we throw at the economic problem, how to tap that and how to make that much more a viable part of the process, and then begin to understand how prices and policies can be redirected to accomplish that end, rather than prices and policies directed to achieve a supply-side focus. I think those are the starting points of the discussion. But as Jeff also said, it has a lot to do with understanding that full opportunity in ways that we've not previously imagined. I'll give you the example, the reason I brought up the Raspberry Pi. Desktop computing brought computing power down to thousands of dollars. Netbooks brought them down to $100. Most people would have difficulty imagining we can get powerful computers down to tens of dollars. But that's possible because somebody asked a different question, namely, what's holding up computer science PhD applicants or candidates from messing with a computer, from actually figuring out how to get their hands around? Because we know that we're at our best when we use our mind and our kinesthetics, our hands, on a problem. And the problem they came up with is the high cost of computers. So they set about to solve that problem, and as a result, we have a byproduct. In a similar spirit, I think we need to step back and redirect our thinking as to how the economy, how the resources really can accomplish this thing we call work by whatever means we choose.
Jeff? Sure.
Yeah,
Jeff, I think it's one.
In this state, we've got a weatherization program run by and one of the options for financing that is you can have them come in and produce more greenhouse gases. And one of the ways that is paying for it up front, the state will subsidize part of it, but the part that they don't, you can actually pay for it through the energy saving on your electric bill. Is that kind of stuff maybe work?
It's starting to work, actually. The answer is yes. But it's been at a fairly timid level. I think Jeff already commented the idea that many people don't want to be the first on your block to try this. They want to see some real success, so there's got to be an example of that. But I will tell you this, I'm also working in France right now. I'm working in a region, Pas-de-Calais, which is a region is the comparable, a functional equivalent of a state here. 4 million people. We have laid out for them a 200 billion euro for 4 million people investment strategy to reduce energy consumption by half over the next 35 years. And they've done it with unanimous consent by the regional council, their governing body, and by the Chamber of Commerce, which is very powerful in that region. In fact, the Chamber's adopted the strategy as its game plan for the next several years. And financing is the thing that turned it around. The idea that, and I think Jeff said it very nicely, energy flows, energy expenditures are generally seen as a cost, an ongoing monthly cost. But how to step back and redefine it in a way that you bring confidence that it is in fact an asset that you can tap into and you can borrow against the productivity gains, the energy savings. So we're beginning to see more of that work take place, but it's been, in my opinion, too timid because we still have essentially a supply side focus.
Right, and just on your first question, I think there's also a very mundane reason when it comes to industrial energy efficiency, which is that plant managers budget for capital expenditures on an annual or biannual basis, and so are unwilling to blow their whole capital expenditure budget on the kinds of upgrades that we're talking about. So there are ways. There's currently in accounting, there's a way to get around it where if you can if you do it through an ESCO or some similar model, you can do it off the books, but that's about to change, is my understanding. And then on the weatherization thing, I can talk to you forever about the weatherization program. But I think there's another mundane thing, which it's very difficult to let people open their houses, to let people come in and do the work. At the same time, I think the on-bill financing stuff is becoming much more prevalent fairly rapidly, especially in big states.
We can talk cheese and cheese.
Yes, sir.
So I'm Mike Kane from LMI, and I'm trying to make sense of some of the things that were said here. So Skip, for example, said that according to the DOE, I think it was that the commercial sector is going to buildings, we rebuild them and get by about half the energy that they get by like that. Well, you didn't say it would be profitable to sort of restructure them in such a way that it would save renewable energy. There was an underlying implication that this would be a good thing to do. We should move in that direction. So here's the AFL-CIO with $6 billion or something like that. And Skip's saying, hey, there's money to be made by owning buildings, taking over buildings, making all these energy efficiency improvements, and then you're selling the buildings and adding them on. So why not a match here?
And we're working on that. That's sort of it's getting that identified as that asset class that makes it a safe investment. Because it's a decent sized industry, but it's still not something that, I mean, the pension funds are generally pretty conservative. And part of even doing our headquarters was to get our culture used to the idea of investing in energy efficiency. So my hope is that soon there will be that match
You
there.
put a lot of people to work, right? I mean,
Yeah.
doing this kind of work.
Oh, absolutely.
Needs one of your major objectives, right?
Yeah, no, there's no dispute. We're just trying to figure out the regulatory hurdles around pension fund investment.
I like the question, Mike, because it's not at all inconsistent story. I'm suggesting that there is a much larger and, yes, cost-effective opportunity we generally perceive. But I like the way Jeff said it. It's a sociological problem as much as anything else. Again, in two different ways. One is thinking of it as a supply problem, I think tends to weaken your understanding and resolve to approach it as a productivity or an efficiency problem in the usual sense. So the opportunity is there. But then we have the problem of fund managers. We have the problem of people who have lack of confidence or not feeling comfortable that the opportunity can be, if you will, mined for their benefit. So there is a need to work through several different layers of opportunity, people, that type of thing, in order to bring about something in a single building or occupied building. So we're not inconsistent. Really, we have fundamentally, I think, a sociological problem as much as anything else.
Right, there's one quote from a meeting that I was in March with one of our trustees. He said, "For the first time in my career as a trustee, I'm more mad at our investment broker than I am at our lawyer." So, I mean, that gives you an idea of the sort of the kind of shift that we have to make people comfortable with this investment.
Yes, Pat?
Would it be possible to have some of the exchange-traded fund providers develop an ETF that is focused on the companies that are involved in the industrial efficiency? So you get the GEs and the Westinghouses and the other firms, Johnson & Johnson, or Johnson Controls and some of the others. And that would be kind of...
That would be very helpful.
That would
Yeah.
create the asset class.
Right.
What's ETF?
It's an exchange-traded fund.
Okay, gotcha.
Yes?
My name is Dave from University of Michigan. This question is for Skip. So we're at 14%. Can you put that in context of, one, other countries and how they're performing, and two, what are theoretical capacities where, or something about where we could be given sort of circumstances?
Yeah, we've got data from 4 countries right now, and others about to emerge. Japan, Austria, and the UK, a surprising mix of countries. But in fact, my colleague Bob Ayers has a graduate student who is just finishing up some preliminary analysis for the EU, the 27 countries of the EU. Generally speaking, it looks like the other nations are, whereas the US might be 14% energy efficient, they may be 18 to 20%. Significantly more when you look at the 14 compared to the 18.